It's about time we start Chicago. Trev's Hockey Show. I'm the Trev. That's too sweet. Anyway, continuing on with retired numbers. And today, after 58 numbers already in the bank, we're finally starting the Chicago Blackhawks. About time, right? Right. And really, for their first retired number, we're talking about, statistically, probably the greatest Blackhawk of all the times. The best one to do it in Chicago. So hopefully, in saying all this, I can do this video some justice. Hopefully, I do this one right. But I'm going to go on a limb here, and I am going to say that if I compare this to the last retired number video I did, we're in for a bit of a long one. So grab a snack, grab a drink, make yourself comfortable as we talk about the first number retired by the Chicago Blackhawks. That was the number 21, worn by, again, statistically, probably the greatest Blackhawk to do it, Stan Mikita. Let's talk about it. Alright, so Stan Mikita's 22-year career, all with the Chicago Blackhawks, began on November 27, 1958, as Mikita was promoted to the Blackhawks from St. Catharines of the OHA as an emergency call-up. And while Mikita would only play in 3 games for the Blackhawks during the 58-59 season, he did get his first NHL assist in his second NHL game to get that first NHL point out of the way. Now, although the Blackhawks did make the playoffs, Mikita would not play in any playoff games. The 1959-60 season would be Mikita's first full season in Chicago. And this was a team that already had the likes of Glenn Hall, Bobby Hull, and Pierre Pilote. So, very, very healthy cog in the wheel. Now, Mikita would score his first NHL goal in his first game of the season against the New York Rangers, while contributing a modest 26 points in 67 games played, but would also lead the team in penalty minutes with 119. So, gotta lead the team in something. And with the Blackhawks making the playoffs, Mikita would make his playoff debut, however, in only 3 games against the eventual and 4-time defending Stanley Cup champs, the Montreal Canadiens. Mikita will only contribute 1 assist. The 1960-61 season would be a much better year, not just for Mikita, but for the Blackhawks in general. And while the Blackhawks did finish 3rd place in the NHL for a 3rd straight year, Mikita would score 53 points in 66 games, which would be good enough for 3rd in team scoring. And while the points from here would start to go up, the penalty minutes would also start to make their way down, with Mikita only adding 100 penalty minutes this season. Not bad, only 100. Now in the playoffs, the Blackhawks managed to avenge their loss from the year before, eliminating the Montreal Canadiens in 6 games to face the Detroit Red Wings for the Stanley Cup. And after a back-and-forth first 4 games, Chicago would win games 5 and 6 very convincingly to win the Blackhawks' first Stanley Cup in 38 years, while also giving Mikita his first and, sadly, only Stanley Cup win. Now, Mikita would contribute 11 points in 12 playoff games, including a league-leading 6 goals. Starting to make the mark. The 1961-62 season would be where Mikita really starts to find his breakouts. This isn't his only breakout year. There's a few. Now, while being paired up with wingers like Ken Warren, Abe McDonald, and Doug Mons, Mikita would find his scoring touch, scoring 25 goals and adding a team-leading 52 assists for 77 points in 70 games, which would put him in a tie for 2nd in league scoring with some guy named Gordie Howe. Now, in the playoffs, the Blackhawks would begin their Stanley Cup defense by playing the Montreal Canadiens for the 4th straight year and eliminating them in 6 games for the 2nd straight year on their way to the Stanley Cup Finals for the 2nd straight year in a row. Unfortunately, I did say this was Mikita only had 1 cup to his name, which is my way of saying the Blackhawks would lose in 6 games to the Toronto Maple Leafs, with Mikita adding 6 goals and a career-high 15 assists for another career high in points with 21 in 12 playoff games. We're already talking playoff career highs at this point. Wow. Now, at the conclusion of the season, however, Mikita would be nominated to the NHL's first All-Star team for the first time in his career. Now, it's around this time when a lot of hockey historians agree that Mikita and Bobby Hull would become synonymous with inventing the curved stick blade. Now, as the story goes, Mikita's stick blade lost a battle with the boards, or more accurately, his stick had become wedged in between a crack in the bench door, though not all the way through, but just enough to give it a V shape. And without pausing to change sticks, Mikita found that he could rip a short, hard, and faster shot with a curve in his stick. Now, soon after that, Mikita and Hull would use all kinds of methods, such as soaking the blade in hot water or wedging them in door jambs overnight just to get the perfect curve. Now, while the curve would become the norm over time, it wasn't always perfect, and over time, the degree of the curve would eventually be regulated. But either way, this is where a lot of the consensus is the curved blade comes from, and you can thank Mikita for that. The 1962-63 season would see Mikita score his first of 16 career hat tricks with the Blackhawks, scoring 3 in a 9-2 win over the Boston Bruins. Now he would score his second, not even a month later, and his third 3 days later. So this is the season where Mikita is becoming a scoring machine. Now the Blackhawks would finish second in the NHL instead of the third place finish, which has been the norm for the past 4 years, with Mikita leading the team in points with 76, which was also good enough for third in league scoring. And he also tied for the team lead with Bobby Hull in goals with 31 each. Now, while the Blackhawks did advance to the playoffs, they ended up facing Gordie Howe and the eventual Stanley Cup finalists in the Detroit Red Wings. This will be a theme in the videos. They're either going to face the eventual finalists or the eventual winners. Just pointing that out. And while the Blackhawks did manage to keep it close in at least the first 4 games, they would eventually lose a heartbreaking Game 5 and a lopsided Game 6, with Mikita contributing 5 points in those 6 games. Now, again, for his regular season, Mikita would be nominated to the NHL's first All-Star team for the second time. 1963-64 would be a season of firsts for Mikita and would include his first of 9 NHL All-Star games. And as far as the regular season would go, the Blackhawks would finish second in the league, again, finishing only 2 points behind the Montreal Canadiens. Now, in terms of stats, Mikita would lead the NHL in points with 89 in 70 games, finishing 2 points ahead of teammate Bobby Hull. Now, in the playoffs, however, the Blackhawks would have a brief visit, as they would lose a back-and-forth 7-game series with the eventual Stanley Cup finalists in the Detroit Red Wings, with Mikita adding 9 points in 7 games. Now, on top of leading the league in points, he also added 146 penalty minutes. But because he did lead the league in points, Mikita would be awarded his first Art Ross Trophy, as well as a nomination to the NHL's first All-Star team for the 3rd time in his career. The 1964-65 season would be yet another dominant year, points-wise, for Mikita, but would also see the Blackhawks finish 3rd in the league, with Mikita finishing with a league-leading 87 points in 70 games, as well as adding a career-high 154 penalty minutes. Now, despite finishing 3rd, the Blackhawks still made the playoffs, first managing to eliminate the Detroit Red Wings in a back-and-forth 7-game series to advance to the Stanley Cup Finals for the 3rd time in 5 years. Now, unfortunately, they would meet the Montreal Canadiens in said finals and somehow managed to take the series to a full 7 games, despite being shut out in 3 of those games. But with that said, the Blackhawks did lose the cup in 7 games to the Canadiens, with Mikita adding 10 points in 14 games. Now, despite coming up short, Mikita was still awarded his 2nd straight Art Ross Trophy, as well as his first nomination to the NHL's second NHL All-Star team. 1965-66 would be another strong season for Mikita, finishing second in team scoring and league scoring with 78 points, only 19 points behind teammate Bobby Hull. But this would be the season where Mikita would see a drastic drop in his penalty minutes, dropping by 96. You remember he finished with the previous season with 154? Well, this year he only finished with 58. No one in front of it, just a simple 58. And for the fourth straight year, the Blackhawks would play the Red Wings in the semifinals, but ultimately would be eliminated in 6 games, with Mikita only managing 3 points in those 6 games. But for his regular season, Mikita would be nominated to the NHL's first All-Star team for the 4th time. The 1966-67 season would be another one of those breakout years for Mikita, and would also see Mikita become one of the first players to wear a helmet full-time in the league after taking an errant shot off the ear. So, safety first, kids. But for Mikita in his season, in the 70 games he did play, he would set a career high in points with 97, as well as setting a career low in penalty minutes with only 12. He's coming a long way in changing the way he plays. Now, those 97 points would lead the team and the league in scoring, finishing 17 points ahead of teammate Bobby Hull, as the Blackhawks would finish first in the NHL standings. Now, in the playoffs, the Blackhawks would play the Toronto Maple Leafs in the semifinals, enjoying a nice change of pace from the last 4 years of having to play the Detroit Red Wings. But sometimes, change isn't always a good thing, as despite the strong regular season, the Blackhawks would be eliminated in 6 games to the eventual Stanley Cup champs, with Mikita adding 4 points. Now again, for the regular season, Mikita would be nominated to the NHL's first All-Star team for the 5th time, as well as being awarded his 3rd Art Ross trophy, as well as his first Hart Memorial Trophy as league MVP, and his first Lady Byng Memorial Trophy for gentlemanly conduct and high skill. That was due to his 12 penalty minutes. Now this would make Mikita the first, and to date, only player to win the Art Ross, the Hart, and the Lady Byng trophies, all in the same season. The 1967-68 season would be another dominant season for Mikita, despite the Blackhawks making a fall in the standings. Now, the Blackhawks would finish 4th in the East Division, just making it into the playoffs, with Mikita leading the league in scoring again with 87 points in 72 games, 3 points ahead of former teammate and future video topic Phil Esposito, while setting career high in goals with 40. Now in the playoffs, the Blackhawks managed to be a force early on, managing to eliminate the New York Rangers in 6 games in the East Division quarterfinals, but could not manage a second straight upset, losing to the eventual Stanley Cup champs in the Montreal Canadiens in 5 games, with Mikita adding 12 points in 11 games. Now, again, for his regular season, Mikita would be nominated to the NHL's first All-Star team for the 6th time, while repeating his success with the same trophies he did the season prior, winning his 4th Art Ross trophy, his 2nd Hart Memorial Trophy, and his 2nd Lady Byng Memorial trophies. So, not only is he the only player to win those 3 trophies in the same season, he managed to do it in consecutive seasons. And it'd be nice to see someone else do that for a change. 1968-69 would almost be more of the same for Mikita. He was still dominant in the points end of things, matching his career high of 97 points while adding a career high 67 assists. But those 97 points would put him 2nd in team scoring, 10 points behind teammate Bobby Hull. And while it did put him 2nd in team scoring, it put him 4th in league scoring, as the first 3 players in league scoring, Esposito, Howe, and Hull, all finished with over 100 points. Yet, for as dominant as the Blackhawks offense might have been, it wasn't enough to get them into the playoffs, meaning Chicago missed the playoffs for the first time in 11 years. The 1969-70 season would be a sharp change of pace. Whereas the team finished last place in the East Division the prior season, they would instead finish first in the East Division in a tiebreaker situation with the Boston Bruins, the tiebreaker being they had fewer goals against. Mikita would finish the season with a team-leading 86 points in 76 games, which was also good enough for third in league scoring. Now, in the playoffs, the Blackhawks made short work of the Detroit Red Wings, taking them out in a 4-game sweep before being swept themselves by the eventual Stanley Cup champs in the Boston Bruins, with Mikita adding 10 points in 8 games. Now, for his regular season, Mikita would be nominated to the NHL's second NHL All-Star team for the second time. Lots of twos in there. The 1970-71 season would see the NHL realign the divisions, and with that move, the Blackhawks were no longer surrounded by their original 6 counterparts in the East Division. Instead, they were placed in the West Division with the second 6, or the whole 1967 expansion class, if you want to put it in a broader term. And this proved to be a big benefit to the Blackhawks, who would finish first in the West Division, with Mikita adding 72 points in 74 games. Now in the playoffs, the Blackhawks would dominate the Philadelphia Flyers in the quarterfinals, sweeping them in 4 straight while outscoring the Flyers 20-8 before going a full 7 games, including a 3-overtime Game 6 to eliminate the New York Rangers on the way to the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time since 1965. So after years of being eliminated by the eventual Stanley Cup champs, or the eventual Stanley Cup finalists, they finally get to be finalists again. Now, unfortunately, the Canadiens were the other Stanley Cup finalists. And even though it was a very close and competitive series, the Blackhawks would eventually lose the Stanley Cup in 7 games, with Mikita going a point per game with 18 points. The 1971-72 season will be yet another dominant season for the Blackhawks, again finishing first in the West Division by a margin of 21 points between them and the Minnesota North Stars, who finished second. Now Mikita would see a bit of a dip in his production, finishing the year with 65 points in 74 games. So not a huge dip, but not the 80-plus points that we're all accustomed to at this point. Now in the playoffs, the Blackhawks took out the Pittsburgh Penguins in 4 games before being unable to find a way past the eventual Stanley Cup finalists in the New York Rangers, being swept out in 4 straight. Now Mikita would add 4 points in 8 games. 1972-73 was supposed to be a year of flux, having lost line mate Bobby Hull to the World Hockey Association, leaving the Blackhawks with a huge hole in the offense. But because the Blackhawks were, in the 1970s, a team that was accustomed to winning, one wouldn't know there was a piece missing. Along the way, Mikita would become the 6th player in NHL history to score 1,000 points in a career, doing so on October 15, 1972. Now Mikita would also find his familiar stride again, putting up 83 points in only 57 games. And the Blackhawks would finish first in the West Division for a 3rd straight year. Now in the playoffs, the Blackhawks would easily eliminate the St. Louis Blues in 5 games, and do the same to the New York Rangers before advancing to the Stanley Cup Finals for the 2nd time in 3 years. Now unfortunately, I say that a lot, for the Blackhawks, they would meet the more dominant team in the Montreal Canadiens to set up a rematch of the 1971 Stanley Cup Finals. And again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And despite taking the Canadiens to 6 games, they'd ultimately lose the Stanley Cup in what would be the last time Mikita would make it to the Stanley Cup Finals as a member of the Blackhawks. Now, in 15 games played, Mikita would score 20 points, including a career-best 7 playoff goals. 1973-74 would see Mikita continue to add to his milestones, playing his 1,000th NHL game on December 5th, 1973, and doing so in style, scoring his 15th career hat trick in the same game. And he would score his 16th and final hat trick on February 2nd, 1974, and finish the season with a team-leading 80 points in 76 games, with the Blackhawks finishing 2nd in the West Division by only 7 points. Now in the playoffs, the Blackhawks would eliminate the Los Angeles Kings in 5 games before losing in 6 games in the semifinals to the eventual Stanley Cup finalists in the Boston Bruins, with Mikita going a point per game with 11 points. 1974-75 would again see the NHL realign their divisions, and this time the Chicago Blackhawks would be situated in the Smythe division of the newly formed Campbell Conference. And this season would also see Mikita play in his 9th and final NHL All-Star game in his career. Now, although the Blackhawks didn't win the division, they did advance to the playoffs by finishing 3rd, with Mikita again leading the team in points with 86 in 79 games. Now, this would be the last time Mikita would score 80-plus points in his career. Now, in the playoffs, the Blackhawks would eliminate the Bruins in 3 games in the preliminary round before being eliminated in the quarterfinals by eventual Stanley Cup finalists, the Buffalo Sabres, in 5 games, with Mikita adding 7 points in 8 games. 1975-76 season will see the Blackhawks use a rotating captaincy and name Mikita co-captain, a position he would hold for the next 2 seasons. For Mikita, though, this would be a short season, seeing him play in only 48 games, but still managing to add 57 points, as the Blackhawks would finish 1st in the Smythe division. And as division champs, the Blackhawks would receive a first-round bye before being swept in the quarterfinals by the eventual Stanley Cup champs in the Montreal Canadiens, with Mikita going pointless in 4 games. The first time he had no points in the playoffs. 1976-77 would be another short season for Mikita, playing in only 57 games, but along the way, Mikita would become the 8th player in NHL history to score his 500th career goal, doing so on February 27th, 1977 against the Vancouver Canucks. Now, all told, Mikita would add 49 points, as the Blackhawks would finish 3rd in the Smythe division. The playoff run, however, would be terribly short, losing only 2 games in the preliminary round to the New York Islanders, with Mikita only registering 1 assist. The positive in this is they didn't lose to a Stanley Cup finalist or a Stanley Cup winner. So there's that. The 1977-78 season would see Mikita play a more full season, but the production was noticeably not what it was, with Mikita scoring 59 points in 76 games. And while the Blackhawks would finish 1st in the Smythe division, in the playoffs, the Blackhawks would again have a first-round bye before being swept in 4, again by eventual Stanley Cup finalists in the Boston Bruins, with Mikita only managing 3 goals. Unfortunately, this would mark the last time Mikita would play in the playoffs in his career. The 1978-79 season would again see Mikita play a short season due to injuries, being limited to only 65 games while adding 55 points. And while the Blackhawks did advance to the playoffs, again after finishing 1st in the Smythe division, injury kept Mikita out. Which ultimately brings us to the 1979-80 season, which would mark Mikita's last season in the NHL. And again, it would be a short season. Actually, it'd be a very short season. Again, thanks to injury. The difference being, for this season and previous short seasons, Mikita would only play 17 games, adding only 7 points to the team's scoring records. And much like the prior season, the Blackhawks did make the playoffs, but again, injuries would keep Mikita out. So due to chronic injuries and with age becoming a factor, Mikita made the decision during the Blackhawks playoff run to announce his retirement from the NHL on April 14th, 1980, leaving a legacy in Chicago, statistically, that is just utterly impressive. So that essentially is the story of Stan Mikita in Chicago. So let's talk about some numbers. All right, so in a team record 1,394 games played, Mikita contributed 541 goals, a team record 926 assists, to go with his team record 1,467 points, while collecting 1,270 penalty minutes. Now, if we're talking playoffs, that's 155 games played, with 59 goals, 91 assists, for 150 points, to go with 169 penalty minutes. Now, all told, he's a 6-time first NHL All-Star team, earning such nominations in 1962, 1963, 1964, 1966, 1967, and 1968, while also finishing on the NHL's second All-Star team twice in 1965 and 1970. He played in 9 NHL All-Star games in 1964, 1967, 1968, 1969, 1971, 1972, 1973, 1974, and 1975. He's a 4-time Art Ross Trophy winner, winning them in 1964, 1965, 1967, and 1968, as well as a 2-time Hart Memorial Trophy winner, which he won in 1967 and 1968, as well as a 2-time Lady Byng Memorial Trophy winner, again winning those in 1967 and 1968. Now, as mentioned in the video, he's the only player in league history to win the Art Ross, Lady Byng, and Hart trophies in the same season, as well as the only player to do it in consecutive seasons. He's a Stanley Cup champ from 1961. He led his team in scoring 8 different times. He was named to the NHL's 100 Greatest Players during the NHL Centennial season. He was nominated to the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1983 and had his number retired by the Chicago Blackhawks on October 19th, 1980. That was a mouthful. So here's my opinion of the guy. So again, another one of those slightly before my time players. I mean, his career was ending as I was being born. But as mentioned, undeniably as far as stats goes, the best Blackhawk of all the times to do it. Mikita was, for lack of a better term, a truly gifted player. And I mean, having Bobby Hull on the same team didn't hurt. Being surrounded by defense like Pierre Pilote and in net by Glenn Hall, that didn't hurt. And I mean, yeah, Tony Esposito come along the way too. But between Hull and Mikita and their 1-2 finishes in league scoring between the late 60s and 70s, it's just fun as a fan to watch players just go back and forth and share the league lead in scoring between one another. That being said, he never had a problem scoring goals. He never had a problem setting up the play, or if he had to be a tough guy, he could do that as well. No shortage of the skills that Mikita possessed. I mean, his hands were gold, his speed was there, and when the legs moved, the legs moved. Obviously, adding that curved blade only helped his repertoire, as well as it should. And obviously, once he decided he didn't want to be a tough guy and the penalty minutes started to decrease, he only got better. Now, in terms of greatness, or at least greatness at the time, when Mikita retired, only Gordie Howe and Phil Esposito had more points than Mikita did, and only 6 players had played in more games than he did. So, on top of his skill, he also had longevity and dedication to the team to be able to play with them for 22 straight years. But again, with longevity aside, just a truly gifted player, a truly great player to watch, and had a great career at the same time. What more can be said? So that's another one of them Trev's hockey shows. I really hope you've made it to this point. But I do appreciate you tuning in, especially if you've made it to this point. If you have made it to this point, do us both a favor. Hit that thumbs up. It would really help me to know that, yeah, you stuck around for nearly a half an hour. So thank you for that time. But if you do like what I'm doing, if you just want to say, hey, you want to let me know you're here, give me that thumbs up. I really would appreciate it. If you want to talk about appreciation, though, that red button that says subscribe all over it, come on, you know you want to. You know I want you to. And the algorithm will thank you for it. It surely will. If you want, there's a link in the description to this video that'll take you to my Facebook page. Feel free to join me there. I'd love to add an audience. As is, I'm really starting to use that page a lot more than what I have in the past. So, you never know what you see on there. Now, moving forward, as far as retired numbers goes, well, I mean, like I said, this is only number 59. There's a lot of them to go still, but know that we are making a bit of a dent, bit of headway in all this retired numbers thing. So we're getting there. But either way, in the meantime, and in between time. Be looking for more videos from the Trev. Later.